What's up, guys? Welcome to another week's episode of GetPsyched. And this week we're going to be taking a look at understanding grief, understanding different theories of grief, and understanding the classic cycle and stages, the 5 stages of grief. So make sure to stay tuned. What's up, guys? Welcome to another week's episode of GetPsyched. And like I said, this week we're going to be taking a look at different theories of grief. We're going to be looking at what those theories actually suggest about grief, and we're going to look at that classic 5-stage theory of grief as well. So the first question that we need to ask is, what exactly is grief all about? Well, it's a strong, powerful, and emotional connection and reaction to something that is attributed to a loss. That could be the death of a person or a traumatic event as well. Grief is a perfectly natural reaction to loss, and I think in many ways in today's society, we think that grief is an unnatural reaction, that people should be strong, meaning that they shouldn't experience grief. But grief is a perfectly normal reaction to experience when you've experienced a loss or a traumatic event, and it's also something that has to be experienced. There's different stages of grief that need to be experienced in order for that grief to be accepted. The dictionary definition of grief actually says that it's an intense feeling of sorrow or sadness connected to the loss of a person. Now, like I said already, grief is very much associated to the loss of an individual, but in truth, grief can be associated to so much more than just the loss or the death of an individual. Now, of course, it's the case that grief primarily is associated with the death of a loved one, but we can also attribute it to other things. The loss of a relationship, for example, the loss of a job even. These kind of things can be associated to grief, and people who have experienced those kinds of losses can experience the cycle of grief as well. So it's not just reserved for the death of a loved one. Okay, so now let's take a look at the grieving process. Now, before we start, there's many different theories to grief. There's many different theories of the process of grief as well, and they all have different critical accounts. We're just going to be taking a look at a couple in today's episode. The first one we're going to take a look at is Rubin in 1981, who looked at the 2-track process of bereavement or grief. Now, this was a model that he himself devised. And the model primarily looked at the long-term ramifications of grief. There was a lot of studies, a lot of understanding about the immediate trauma of grief or the immediate trauma of loss, but there was little in the way of understanding how the grieving process extended over a long period of time and how people actually were impacted by the loss of a person over an extended period of time. Now, this model was primarily utilized as well in order to assist people in moving through the different stages of grief. So there was that 2-track model. There was the initial track and then there was the second track to look at how people could be helped, how people could be understood as they prolonged their grief over that longer period of time. Now, track 1 of the 2-track model looked at the initial trauma of the event, so the anxiety, the depression, the trauma experienced after the initial loss of an individual. It was really important in this model that the person understood how close that person was who's experiencing the grief to the person that was lost. The closer that bond, the closer that relationship, then the more intense that first track would be, that first experience of anxiety and depression and trauma after the loss of an individual. Track 2 looked at the developing relationship between those two individuals. Now, I know that sounds strange because one of those people had passed away, but that second track looked at the prolonging period of grief and how the relationship still felt a part of the person's life who was grieving. So that was one of the first pieces of theory, a little bit of research in there as well, that looked at the long-term ramifications of grief and how people actually experience grief over the longer term. There's also been other extensive research in grief, and Bonanno primarily is one of the most prominent figures in the research in grief actually. His book, The Other Side of Sadness, was a work that he conducted that really encapsulated all of his research in grief. He's one of the most prominent figures in grief research, and that book is primarily there to kind of encapsulate the majority of his research that he conducted. His research fundamentally stipulated that natural resilience is the key factor to ensuring that grief stages are experienced effectively and that people can eventually get to that point of acceptance of their grief and of the person that they've lost. He saw resilience as the key factor. He was also the first person in grief research to use pre and post measurements. So he's probably the first person that we can start to stipulate is a true scientist when it comes to actually researching grief. Yes, there's many other factors that contribute to somebody utilizing real science, but him being the first, or one of the first, to use pre and post questionnaires or pre and post assessment criteria to be able to understand the process of grief and how grief actually impacts somebody initially and over the long term, we can start to see that there's more of an empirical basis starting to form around grief research, thanks to Bonanno. Now, throughout his scientific research, he stipulated that there were 4 trajectories of grief. The first one is resiliency. Now this is where somebody is able to maintain a healthy level of realization towards their grief, whilst also moving towards an acceptance of the loss of a person. The second is recovery. Now this is where somebody experiences the grief, experiences the anxiety, the depression, the trauma, all the things that are associated with immediate loss, but also is able to, over the longer term, get themselves back to a healthy platform that they were before they experienced the grief. The third one is chronic dysfunction. Now this is where somebody is struggling to function at a normal level even after a long period of time of experiencing that grief. And the fourth one is delayed grief or trauma. Now this is where somebody seems to recover very quickly from grief, but over a number of months after the loss of an individual, that grief all of a sudden reappears in a more ferocious form normally. Okay, so that's us taking a little look at the theories of grief, that's us taking a little look at some of the research associated with grief as well, but there is a classic 5 model theory to grief that you might be very, very familiar with. It's called the Kubler-Ross model also, and it's based on his 1969 book called Death and Dying. Now this theory was initially created in order to understand the stages of grief that somebody goes through who is actually in the process of dying. It wasn't associated for people experiencing grief of a loved one who is about to be lost. But as time progressed, they recognised that these stages were very applicable to people experiencing grief over a longer term after someone had died. Now the 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression and acceptance. Now this theory stipulates that these stages have to be experienced in order for somebody to get to that stage of acceptance. Now they can happen in any order so long as acceptance comes last, obviously. One of the main issues with grieving is that so many people don't allow themselves to grieve, or they don't think that grieving is an appropriate reaction to the loss of somebody. This might be something that you've heard of before, and this theory, the 5 stages, the 5-stage model of grief, argues that what can happen is that people can get stuck in certain stages. People can get stuck in an anger stage, they can get stuck in a depression stage after the loss of somebody, and you can understand how this can happen at times. What happens is that they've not allowed themselves to fully express or understand that stage in order to move on to the next one. And that's what this theory would argue anyway. Grief is extremely complex, and if anything, these different theories show that there's so many different ways of experiencing grief, there's so many different ways of trying to understand grief and understand what its purpose is. Perhaps a high number of theories are evidence to this, just with how complex grief can actually be. Okay guys, thanks so much for watching this week's episode of GetPsyched. This week we've been taking a little bit of a look at grief, we've been taking a little short look at some of the theories around grief, and we've also taken a look at that classic 5-stage model of grief. If you've been enjoying today's video guys, then make sure to hit that like button. You can comment on the video as well and I'll get back to you. You can feel free to share it as well. And if you've been enjoying GetPsyched as a whole, then make sure to hit that subscribe button. You can hit that little bell next to the subscribe button and you'll get weekly reminders of every time I upload. Thanks so much for watching guys, and hopefully catch you next week.